have to say thank you so much for writing this book. I learned so much from reading it, both about the Native American community and also about philanthropy. For example, in your book, you use the term Native American and Indian interchangeably, but you say if you aren't Indian, you better stick with the term Native American. Thanks for letting me in on that. Can we start by you telling me a little bit about where you're from and the Lumbee tribe?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out in the rain and everything. So I'm from North Carolina, from the Lumbee tribe. We are a tribe that is in southeastern North Carolina. It's a rural area. If you are driving up I-95 from Miami to New York, you run right through our community. The Lumbee tribe has about 60,000 members. We're the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River. So there's kind of a lot of us. We are not federally recognized. We are recognized by the state of North Carolina. And that's a nuance that we don't have to get into today, but recognition of tribes by the U.S. government is a long, complicated history and a struggle that we still face. My tribe's been fighting for recognition for many, many years. We were actually recognized in the 50s by the federal government without any benefits. Not that you get a lot of benefits when you are recognized by the government, but there's something about just the idea of being recognized to be acknowledged that you are who you say you are that has profound impacts, on our community, psychologically, emotionally, all of those things. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. I feel like my voice is like sometimes. So yeah, that's my community. We are, in Robeson County, North Carolina. It's one of the most diverse counties in the country. We, for many, many years, were like a third white, a third black, and a third Indian or Native American. With immigration and a lot of changes in our demographics, we're now quarter Latino, quarter white, quarter black, quarter Indian. And so it's a very diverse community. Our culture still remains and is strong. We don't have a language. That's a question that we get often. We were the very first point of contact for the settlers. So if you know your U.S. history, and often this part is kind of left out of the books because we hear about Jamestown and some of the other colonies that were successful. The very first attempt at colonizing in this country was in North Carolina, in coastal North Carolina, when settlers came and attempted to colonize. So folks were setting up, and then some of the settlers went back to England to get supplies, and when they came back, the colony was gone, and it's called the Lost Colony. And so we've been exposed to whiteness or colonization for longer than any indigenous community in the country. So I'm really proud that any strand of anything remotely indigenous remains in our community. And if you visit, you'll definitely see, wow, like you'll feel the spirituality and see the nativeness that's been there for many, many, many years.
You noted in the book that as a Native American, you're a rare phenomenon in the field of philanthropy. Can you say why that's such a rarity and how you gained access in?
Yeah. So when I started working in institutional philanthropy, you guys know what that is, that whole sector of like foundations and charity. I was only one of about 10 Native Americans, this was like 14 years ago, that I knew of because we found each other and we tried to count, and there was only 14 of us. And that's changed a little bit. We're now up to about 25, so we are taking over slowly but surely. But there's a lot of reasons why that is the case. One, when you come from poverty and you come from a community of color or a community that's been marginalized, you don't have the wealth to start a foundation in the first place. So the way foundations are started in this country is usually by a family that has wealth, or an individual that has wealth, a corporation that has wealth, that starts a foundation, gets a tax break, and creates these organizations that are then supposed to benefit the community. We can talk about if that's really happening or not. And so someone from my background just doesn't have the wealth in general to be able to start a foundation. So, and then when foundations are started, they typically are staffed by people from a family, might be a family foundation, and so their family makes up the board, or people that they know, right? So people in their network, so they hire other folks who look like them or have comfort around that type of lifestyle or way of being. And so someone like me that is not from that world, it's just a very strange place to find yourself. And so I found myself there 14 years ago by kind of stumbling into the space. There was a foundation in North Carolina called the Cape B. Reynolds Charitable Trust. And this was a foundation that was started from R.J. Reynolds' family, who was old tobacco money. They had several foundations in North Carolina. And a new president came to run Cape B. Reynolds Foundation, or Cape B. Reynolds Charitable Trust. And she was a woman of color, the first woman and the first person of color in the foundation's history. And she wanted to diversify the staff. She wanted to bring on another person of color, so she wouldn't be the only one. And then also in terms of age, I was really young. I was 28, and that was really unheard of. I think at the time, I didn't know any other program officers in the country who were around my age as well. And so that was, someone just kind of took a chance on me, and I had majored in public health and studied at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And this was a health foundation, so I had experience in the community around community health issues, and but getting on the inside of this foundation and was a whole new world, a totally different experience for me. And then, when you get in, staying in is another question, right? So the culture that exists in many foundations, the way of doing things, the status quo, I did not feel like this particular institution, or many of the institutions that I've worked in, were built for my success. So when we do break in to work in this field, we often don't last because of the dynamics of the culture that exists in the organizations.
You sort of pointed at this in your answer when you were saying, we'll talk about if the philanthropic organizations are working well at doing what they were sort of set out to do. But so one of the things one of the main focus of the book is how you talk about how the colonial history of America can make philanthropic work difficult. And I hadn't even thought about or ever imagined those two ideas on top of each other. It's such an exciting idea in the book. So can you talk about sort of that struggle and then how it relates to the foundation's struggle to help the community?
Yeah. So our history of colonization in this country just touches everything, right? And I think when you think about colonization and what it was about, right, it was really about accumulating wealth. And the mantra of colonization was dividing and exploiting and conquering and separating people. All of these tactics that probably sound familiar because it's still happening today, right? Families are still being separated. Folks are still being exploited so that others can earn wealth from that exploitation. And so colonization is really that history and legacy of colonization in this country. I think just permeates every cell of our being, our way of doing things. In this country, we don't have a concept of having enough. I've been thinking about that lately. At what point do we have enough? We're good, right? It doesn't matter how much money you have. We have this mindset that it's not enough, and we have to keep working harder and getting more money and amassing more wealth, which is a very counter way of thinking and being in indigenous communities. So that mindset of accumulating wealth by any means necessary, whether we're extracting from the land or harming the land or harming other folks, is something that this country was established upon. And so when we think about how that connects to philanthropy in the charity sector, one, you have to ask, where did this wealth come from in foundations, right? This wealth came from, from corporations and from Wall Street, and, however wealth has been earned historically, philanthropy is connected to that. And so when you look at places like where I used to work, the R.J. Reynolds Foundation, well, not the Kate B. Reynolds Foundation that came from R.J. Reynolds' money, this was a family that earned their wealth off the backs of slavery and stolen lands and all kinds of things, horrible things that happened in our history in North Carolina. And so then we as a foundation who now had this wealth and were the gatekeepers to this wealth, had to acknowledge there was a dark history, a dark side of exploitation and colonization that led to the generation of this wealth. So I think we are, to be really self-righteous, to be like, oh, I work in philanthropy and I'm not connected to any of that stuff over there, capitalism and Wall Street and all of that. No, we are. And the history, the dark history that has underlined the accumulation of wealth on Wall Street and in other places is very much connected to this sector. It is a part of who we are. And then so the dynamics, when you look at the history of where the wealth came from, and then you look at who's controlling the wealth, who makes decisions about where to invest it, how to allocate it, who gets the grant funding, when you look at all of that and begin to unpack that, you will see that a lot of the same type of dynamics are there where we're not investing in communities of color. And to me, this is a major injustice that communities of color have for generations contributed to the accumulation of wealth for these foundations, right? We help folks get wealthy, if you not voluntarily in many cases, right? But our ancestors had a role in because of genocide and stolen land and slavery and exploiting low-wage workers, we contributed to the accumulation of wealth, and now we're getting crumbs of that back in terms of community investment from philanthropy. So that is where I say philanthropy is perpetuating colonial dynamics. If we are not using our money to, repair the harm that colonization has caused.
You said, that reminds me of a quote that you said you quoted this philosopher in the book, Derek Rasmussen, and he said, what makes people indigenous? Indigenous people believe they belong to the land, and non-indigenous people believe the land belongs to them. Can you talk about how thinking about philanthropy from an indigenous point of view changes how you work in philanthropy?
Yeah, it changes everything. So in the book, I kind of talk about my identity as a Native person being complicated because, my family moved to the city when I was 5 so I can go to better schools. And like a lot of, people of color, immigrants, so forth, you are kind of taught to assimilate. Our proximity to whiteness makes us better. And so I was not growing up exposed to a lot of my Native culture. Like things were there, but I just thought this is how we live in this house, or I didn't know it was because we were Native necessarily. And so my identity as a Native was complicated, and then going through university and then working in a sector that is very concentrated with white privilege and power and wealth, I completely assimilated some of that forced, some of it out of my own willingness in order to be successful at my job. And I many years later, feeling really disconnected in my own identity, from my community, and just disillusioned, I think, by the whole thing of philanthropy being not what I thought it would be. I had the opportunity with this book to really reconnect with my community and spend time talking to elders and just really soaking in like all this indigenous wisdom of, basic stuff around like, how do we view the world? Like, what do we mean by philanthropy? None of my elders knew what that word was. They were like, what does that mean, right? But what do we mean about how do we take care of each other? Like, what are our traditions? If someone's in need, how do we respond to that? And so, these conversations really reminded me, because I know it's in my DNA, reminded me of who I am and like how we really should exist in this space of trying to make a difference and trying to be supportive and helping others. And so from that, I took a lot of lessons, to really shift our hearts and our minds around what we could be as a sector. And all of us who, if you're a donor, we all give personally of our time and our treasure and our talent. If you work in banking, any type of institution that controls access to capital, there's a major opportunity there to shift our thinking from how wealth has traumatized and harmed communities to like how can wealth and money actually be something that facilitates healing and connectedness and bringing us back together and restoring balance, all those types of things. So I can get into some specifics about that, but that's basically the journey that I went on, that I share in the book, that brought me to some of these revelations.
That you're sort of answering my next question, or leading me to my next question is, so the book brings up this idea of decolonization. And so can you talk a little bit about what a decolonized work environment might look and feel like, what a decolonized learning environment might feel like, and what a decolonized economy might be like?
Whoa. How much time we got?
Or pick your favorite space you want to decolonize.
Okay. So the word decolonize or decolonization, it's become a buzzword. Which I'm thankful for, with the book, it's like, and thanks Black Panther. But when I started the process of writing this book, it was a term that I only heard here and there kind of in native spaces, and in some movement spaces, people were kind of using that frame. So really understand decolonization, you have to understand what colonization is, right? So I often think about colonization. There's a difference because people confuse like conquering and colonization. Conquering is when you go to someone's land, you take their stuff, kill anyone who gets in your way, and then you leave, right? So colonization is different. When you colonize, you go to someone else's land and you stay, and you don't leave, and then you force the existing indigenous people to become you. It's like a zombie apocalypse. It's like you just literally like biting people on the neck and turning them into you. And so there is that's sort of what colonization is all about. Again, separating, dividing, controlling. It's motivated out of fear. And in the case of the history of this country, there was an assumed like God-given superiority, right? Like I'm doing this in the name of God, that entitles me to do this. And so those are the elements that underlie what colonization is and sort of the dynamics of the process. And so that's why colonization is not something that happened just 5 years ago. It's still happening. And so when you watch the news, my God, the terrible things that are happening right now, to me, it's like colonization all over again, right? We saw in the news last night and this morning, the tear gas that's being sprayed on kids and, children and women and innocent folks who are seeking asylum at the border. 2 years ago, it was gas on folks who were at Standing Rock, right? And so this is to incite fear. This is to keep the walls up and to separate and to exploit folks, all in the name of us being superior, as a country, and using domination and control as a tactic to keep things as they are, or for to keep our economic system in a way that keeps benefiting only a small percentage of our community. And so when you think about decolonizing, I mean, it's a process. There's no silver bullet. There's not a workshop or a weekend that you could go to decolonize. It is a lifelong journey. And for me, it really started with this book, my own process of decolonizing my mind. And that is like really understanding what are the white dominant ways of doing business or showing up or thinking, because we swim in this, right? Like all the stats are in the book around like who works in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, but also who decides the textbooks that we use in colleges, right? Who's controlling the media and the airwaves and all the messages that we're receiving? It's mostly white men. And so we are just being constantly conditioned to think a certain way, behave a certain way, lead in a certain way, lift up a certain type of expertise above a different kind. So all of that thinking to decolonize yourself is like literally, the moving sidewalks of the airport. It's like turning around backwards on that thing and like walking against the crowd, right? If you can imagine a JFK doing that, that's what it feels like to like because you're having to unlearn and go in a different direction at the same time. So it's very, very complicated. There is a process that I outline in the book to like start it. Like there's a place to begin. And the first step is really understanding and coming to terms with the truth. Like what is the truth of our history? What is the, whatever sector you're working in or whatever issue you care about that you're trying to change in the world, understanding the real history of what happened to lead to that situation, right? Like, why are we fighting for affordable housing? Because there's been intentional redlining and policies and systems that have led to folks, poor folks and people of color not being able to afford housing, right? And so you have to really understand and racialize and understand the historical policies and systems that led to these things. And then there, once you know the truth, come to terms with that, you can begin the process of shaping your thinking or shaping your business strategies or your investment strategies or whatever your line of work is to really get at the root causes of these issues.
I think that your book did such a good job of talking not only about the history of colonization and then the structures within our community. It's amazing. Like this, when you talk about architecture, like that totally blew my mind. And then I was walking around the city like, oh. But also your book does a great job about talking about those first steps to recognizing like, and then what? And then what happens? Yeah. And for myself, like white privilege and white supremacy in our country is still ideas that like I'm learning to process and learning what to do with, because I grew up being unaware of that privilege. And once I was aware of it, for me, one of the questions I had was like, so what do I do now that I see something? And you tell this story in the book about the young white man who was speaking in Charleston, South Carolina at the Grant Makers for Southern Progress conference. Can you just tell that story? Because for me, that was so helpful for like, okay, because that's what you do.
Yeah, so this story is so powerful. I actually was not even in the room, and this story impacted me when the actual thing happened. There was a conference of grant makers in Charleston, folks who care about the South and progress there. Was anybody there? I know you were there. I don't know if you were in the room when it happened. But so a lot of people of color in the room, because unfortunately, when it comes to issues of racial and economic justice, it's like the people of color show up usually, and we're working on getting those white men around the boards and leadership positions to be in the room with us. But anyway, so a lot of people of color and a young white man, I think he was from the area, somebody correct me if I get this story wrong, and got up to make a presentation. Before he made the presentation, he shared that he had done research on his family, and his family had owned slaves, I believe, in Charleston, South Carolina, where we were all gathered. And he put up a slide that literally showed his, I guess his great-great-grandfather, where there were names listed of the slaves that they owned. And he just basically said, I want to acknowledge this history of how my family has contributed to the challenges that we're talking about today. And I'm committed to doing my part. I'm sorry for that, and I'm committed to doing my part to, really change and repair the harm that's been done. And it was such a moment of like, wow, because often as people of color, we're in these spaces. No one has ever apologized to us for, and for the history. And so it really impacted folks. And that night we were going to dinner. I was in a car with like 4 other people of color, and we were going to dinner, and someone brought it up, and that's how I learned of the story. And everyone was just amazed that he had done this, and we're so moved and touched. And so often I think for white people, there are so many well-meaning white people who, like you said, they don't know where to begin or how to start a journey or what to do, or they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. But actually just like acknowledging, like, one, you got to do the work, right? Like you have to do the work to what's your family's history? A lot of white people know, like we don't know because we don't have any papers or anything in my family. No one kept track. But if your families had resources, there's probably a history there where you can figure out and understand how your family may have played a role in some of these issues, whether on a side of fighting for civil rights and racial justice or, not. And so, like actually doing that work, I think is liberating probably for a white person. And that's what I've heard from white people, that, it's very sad if you find out that your family owned slaves or were a part of genocide or whatever. But also just to kind of know where you show up in the history of all of this, I think is liberating to begin to do something about it. And so that's the story. I'll also share another quick story I'll share. There's a letter that I take around with me everywhere. And I almost dropped it in a mud puddle coming in. I was like, oh my God. But this letter, there's a woman named Hillary in the book that I talk about. And I met Hillary. I went to this like Native fundraising conference or something. It was like a conference of a bunch of Native folks. I was like, wow. And I was on this panel, and there was this white lady on the panel with me. And I'm like, who's this white lady? Why is she up here? Like all these Indians. I'm like, okay, a white savior is up here. Okay. And then I found out she was wealthy and had given some money. So I was like, okay, well, it's, they were welcoming her in. And then, as she began to talk, I sat back and just really listened. And I was like, okay, I'm bringing my own bias. Like, I need to be more open-minded and really hear her out. And so she said some really profound things. Like, I was like, she's done her work. She's really been doing some work. And it was really healing for me to hear her share her story of like, the work that she's been doing. Because I don't know, as a person of color, like I have my own work to do and my own trauma I'm dealing with, but to know that others are doing their work, especially white people, I'm like, okay, we might get somewhere. We actually might get somewhere in this country. So long story short, Hillary did her work and found out that her family owned black and Lumbee slaves in North Carolina, in the county that's adjacent to where my tribe is. And she wrote a letter of apology to me. And at first I was like, oh, this is kind of silly or whatever, right? But when I read it, it really, it transformed me. It made me, it was just so healing for me. I can't even begin to explain, because no one has ever said they're sorry to me, right? And I've never actually walked around thinking anyone owed me an apology, to be honest, right? But to actually have someone to acknowledge it and to apologize to me for what their ancestors did to my ancestors was deeply transformative and healing for me. And of course, it was very healing for her. And so apologizing is one of the steps I talk about in terms of decolonizing your thinking and your mind and our institutions. We have to acknowledge, and then we have to apologize. And so last thing about it, in her letter, she not only apologized to me and my Indigenous relatives, she apologized to her family. And let me see. I want to like just read this 2 sentences because I think it's like really amazing. So she apologized to her Indigenous relatives and relatives of color. That's me. But then to her European descendant relatives, she wrote, I apologize for all the times I have judged you instead of allowing myself to feel the grief of our collective spiritual impoverishment and cultural amnesia. I apologize for seeing you as a monster of oppression instead of a child of creation. I apologize for disassociating from you and denying that we are all related. When I judged you, I judged my own ancestors, my children, and myself. I am sorry. I love you. Please forgive me. And what was so powerful about that, because not only did she become a woke white person and realize that she needed to do this, she had begun creating distance between other white people because she was woke, and she's like, oh, they're not woke. I'm going to go over here and be with these people of color. But no, like she realized, like, I need to actually organize my own people. I need to not disassociate myself with the community from whence I came, right? And so I thought it was beautiful that she recognized the impact of this trauma not only on my community but on her own community and herself.
Thank you for sharing that personal letter. I'm going to ask you one more question. You talk about in the book this philanthropy mentor and fellow Lumbee Native American Donna and what she taught you. And I just marked this passage in the book of this like memory she told you about because I thought it was so beautiful and relatable, and it kind of like when she told the story, it really made me think, I don't know, I just thought it was so great. I wonder if you could just read it.
Oh, sure. This is unscripted in practice. Which one?
On the bottom here.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to say more about who she is or if it's okay to just tell the story.
Sure. So Donna Chavez is a Native elder in my community. She actually worked in philanthropy when I got into philanthropy. She was in North Carolina, and so I was very fortunate to actually have a Native elder who had worked in this space. That's very rare. She was one of the founders of Native Americans in philanthropy, which so many people claim to be. We're unsure who really was the founder. There's a debate, but she claims to be one of the founders, and we believe her. And just a person that through the years has been there to support me and share her wisdom with me. So I call her my philanthropy mother. So she shared this story. Years back, around 1992, I was at a youth and elders gathering at Onondaga. I hope I'm saying that right. I was in the cookhouse, the community space. We did everything there: shower and hang out and meet, as well as cook and eat. So it was called the cookhouse. It was the end of the gathering, so we were ready to leave. We were packing up, and there was an elder sitting on the table with a youth. That's the way learning was done. I was ready to leave, but then I heard him say, Europeans coming to this land was not a problem. As an elder, he had memories of some of the historic activities and atrocities by the U.S. government against Native peoples. So when I heard him say that, I decided to stay and listen to him. The problem was, he went on, they forgot their teachings. I'll never forget that moment because it just opened my heart. There are people who remember the teachings, non-Indigenous too. But Indigenous peoples are a living reminder. We are not gone, no matter how many times they try to make us invisible. We're here as a living reminder. That's what we can be to all institutions if we're allowed to be.
I thought that was so beautiful, and I just felt like it so encapsulated like the feeling of all the knowledge that your book has and kind of all the ideas that it sort of, I felt like when I read it, my mind, I just kept being like, oh my gosh, I didn't know about that or that or that, and also big ideas about our culture and how we work within it. So thank you for all you wrote in it. I just want to open it up to some questions because I know there are things that like I'm so excited to talk about, but I'm sure there are reasons you all came here and ideas you want to talk about too. So if anyone has any questions, this is your chance.
Since nobody wanted to go, I'll just go.
You're brave.
Thank you. So I feel like, before even reading the book, there are so many parallels to philanthropy abroad. So I was wondering if you can talk about, any thoughts you have on foreign or humanitarian aid, because I'm sure that, humanitarian aid, charity abroad, especially for, brown people abroad, more or less, is an industry that is predicated on imperialism. So I I just want to know what your thoughts are on that, and if you have any, I guess, recommendations on how to reform from within.
Yeah, really good question. Wow. So I did interview some folks who worked in nonprofit organizations and NGOs, international work, and doing the book. And yeah, I mean, the same dynamics are there. The white savior complexes, and sort of the transactional kind of way of parachuting in, dropping resources or forcing agendas and logic models on communities that may not want them. So I think it's what I write about philanthropy rings true of the NGO world in the book. And I tried my best to encapsulate the problem and the solutions that would be applicable outside of just the small world of foundations. We're really a small little world. And so, yeah, I think, the same in terms of sort of disrupting that is sort of the same approaches that I talk about in the solution side of the book, of really identifying the colonial dynamics, right? And so I name what some of those are. I talk about ways that institutions can hold up a mirror to kind of self-examine how they may be contributing to those dynamics, or how they can identify and disrupt, and begin dismantling that. But it's from things that are like obvious to like who's on the board, what does the leadership of organizations look like, to what are their processes when you get into the weeds of how they're allocating resources, what are their expectation and mandates on their community partners. But it's huge. And there's one book when I was doing research on reading a lot of things that I found that was specifically about NGOs, and the book was called Philanthropy Sucks. And I don't know if they have it here. I found it online and I ordered it, and I'm like reading it, and it's like just ripping apart, NGOs. So I don't know. I found the book like funny, but also sad and truthful. So, but yeah. So yes, I think reading the book, you'll see me talk a lot about those dynamics and some ideas for kind of disrupting those.
Yeah. Hi.
So I've been organizing for 20 years, and just this year moved into the philanthropy side of things, which is an interesting place to be. And I'm wondering, I see, and I'm really excited to read your book and think more about sort of, you already seem to be making some really strategic moves about how do we get the most money and move towards like a reparations model. I'm wondering if you can speak to like whether we can actually have, and maybe you can't, decolonization within racial capitalism, and like whether like it doesn't actually require us to work ourselves out of a job within philanthropy.
Wow, good question. Well, welcome, I guess, to philanthropy. Someone said the other day that we keep taking amazing organizers out of the field and making them like mediocre grant writers and executive directors or whatever. But I think there's a lot of there. This isn't exactly your question, but I'll get to it. I think having more and more folks who come from the movement working in philanthropy is one reason we're seeing this shift, right? Like we're working kind of on the inside out, and you're beginning to see, I think, the results of that happening. And so. In terms of capitalism, I'm not an economist, so I steered away from like directly digging into that area, but instead I sort of went the route of Malcolm X said you can't have capitalism without racism. So I think that it's, capitalism is very problematic. It needs to change. It's not working for everyone. I'm probably more of an incremental change kind of person. The idea of completely just shutting down the system scares me because, that's, I don't have a safety net. But I do. So I talk more about sort of dynamics of white supremacy that show up in that system and kind of how to dismantling that. So that's. So I think the answer is yes. I believe that we can have a system that is a different kind of system from the one we have now, but maybe where incremental change has happened that could work, right? I do think there's a role for philanthropy. I do dream of a world where philanthropy doesn't exist, per se, that we don't need it, that it's like Wakanda, But I think that, I come from a culture of, giving and receiving. It's always been a part of our culture. If you want to call that philanthropy, I think there will always be a place for giving. If you have more than you need, giving that away. But it's the spirit of which we do it that is not about domination or control, but about, reciprocity. And so that's, I think if we can bring those values and that worldview to a discussion about capitalism, we can find ways to change capitalism to work for more people. I would like to think that. I mean, ultimately, it probably has to be completely, just completely shut down. But that is, in a lot of my conversations with folks, including a lot of activists when I was writing the book about what would it take to actually completely dismantle philanthropy and, as we currently see it, it's a place where people lack imagination. I mean, even amazing activists that are dismantling all kinds of systems of oppression. When it came to philanthropy, because it's sort of, I describe it in the book as like it being this raft that we're sitting on, and it's not perfect, but we're afraid to punch a hole in it because it's all we got. I think that's how people feel about capitalism in a way, even in our most radical thinking, but definitely philanthropy, which is supposed to be like the good side of it. So I don't have a direct answer for that, but I think it's continuing to push forward to conversations about white supremacy, because that is, in my opinion, what really underpins capitalism, making it work for a small percentage of our communities.
Hi. I read your book and really appreciate all the thinking in it, and so many authors that you brought in that I can go look to now. I was wondering to hear your thoughts about the piece on grief and listening and apologizing, and how you've obviously done a lot of work here, and how to bring that into institutions and in communities. Like, if you have thoughts about that, the processes of whether you've done that in certain institutions you've worked in or communities, because I think that's a really powerful part of the thinking there. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for reading the book. I do think that the process I outline in the Steps to Healing can be organizational. Like, organizations can go through the process. I think it all starts as a very personal experience. I think we have to change and have a personal analysis that we're bringing into the workplace. One place where I have been working for about a year and a half to go through some of these steps, I've seen it working, right? And it started with a process of, let's figure out what the truth is here, right? And so coming to terms with that. And then I saw grief. I saw people beginning to say, well, if we change this, well, one, like grief around like, wow, now we understand like why things are this way. We feel really bad about it. Motivation to make changes based off of a place of true understanding and wanting to get to a place of reconciliation. And so there is that I think from that sadness, a motivation that can inspire action. But what I want to say, I think sort of like white dominant culture, though, when it comes to grief, is very uncomfortable with that stage. There's a tendency to want to quickly, that's terrible, what can we do to fix it? Or when we talk about the truth and the history, there's an inclination to say, where is the room, where is the dark, smoky room where people make those decisions? I want to know who was in there, because that was wrong, and I want to, whatever. So it's very uncomfortable to just sit in grief, right? And so I encourage folks, I think when you really get to a place of true grief, you can't rush it. It's going to work its way through your body. You cannot. it will be done when it's ready to be done. And on the other side of that, you can really get to a place of like true healing. And so in terms of how that shows up in an organization, it's a little tricky. I think that in the book, I talk about organizations making space at work for grief. And so, like, we are living, if you're working in an organization, especially, a social justice organization or an organization that's a social change organization, to actually have a space at work where we're like, wow, this happened today. Can we process this together? We don't have to come up with a strategy today, but can we just like be together and hold each other in this moment because of this terrible thing that happened? And I can't say how many times, in places where I've worked where we were funding a very specific issue and something popped off, like 3 unarmed black men were killed within 24 hours, but then we were expected to just move on with our day without having a chance to to even like talk about or express how we're feeling. So I think it's creating places in our organizations where we can actually be human and feel and express grief and sadness and not be expected to be the expert that day. Like maybe it's okay to feel sad about what's going on, and to shed some tears, and then tomorrow we come back together and begin strategizing maybe how we're going to respond. But we're so quick to be the first ones, like we got to send out that e-blast about responding to this thing that happened, and that we have a strategy to and I just think that's not authentic. It's not contributing. It's not helping an organization evolve to be one that is really an organization that has gone through a healing process. So that's some of my ideas around grief. And then I think, was there another question in there?
Well, it's just the process, the steps, and thinking of how to bring that into American culture where we're not really comfortable with, like you were saying, like expressing emotions. There's a lot of shutdown.
There's an article, and I need to memorize the author of this article because I refer to it every other day. If you Google white dominant culture, there's an article that came out that is so good, and it lists like 10 elements of white dominant culture and how it shows up in organizations. One that I think about a lot because I feel like it shows up in my daytime job is commitment to the written word, right? And on the surface, that doesn't seem like a bad thing, right? Like, and we're talking about a book. I wrote something. So, but, those are white dominant characteristics or cultural things that show up in organizations that I encourage everyone to like read and study and be like, wow, did we do this here? Because just even changing small things like that can like create an atmosphere where people of color who work there will feel more like they belong. That might open up your processes to reach people that you haven't reached before. So check out that article and like pair that with the book, and I think you'll get some really good ideas.
We have time for just maybe 2 more.
Could you pass this up front?
Thanks. What's your advice for those of us who work in the sector who are people of color ourselves to hold our own communities accountable? Like there are a number of people of color who adopt dominant culture, who adopt the attitudes, the practices, the behaviors, don't necessarily see it, sometimes recognize their own oppression, but then are happy to oppress others or not, not recognize the oppression of others. So what is your advice to those of us who want to hold our communities accountable?
Yeah, love that question. So one thing that in the book, the whole first half, I use a plantation analogy because I literally worked on a plantation, when I got into this field. And the plantation analogy is something that people of color, we in the South at least, we used to refer to how we felt at work, right? Like the nonprofits were the field hands on the front lines, and then we were the house slaves because we were the people of color who got in and had some power and proximity. And then there were the overseers. So there's a whole chapter in the book on the overseers. And the overseers are sort of like the leadership of the foundation, and many times they can be people of color. And just like in plantation times, overseers that were people of color were often even more cruel to their community than the actual white folks. And that has been my experience in this sector. In fact, I've worked in 3 foundations, and all 3 of my presidents of my foundations have been people of color. And so, we're talking about race here, and but there is something, also about power that can impact you, your proximity to power that can impact you regardless of what the color of your skin might be. And so I think it's really important that that's a conversation that we have, and we find ways to hold each other accountable, because I found in my sector, in philanthropy, that other people of color were not holding other people of color accountable. We saw people with abusive leadership, but, it's like, oh, we can't say anything because it's a person of color, and like, if they don't do a good job, they won't hire another person of color. So it's like all these dynamics. So I chose, and I was really anxious about it, but I chose to call it out and write a whole chapter about internalized oppression in the book, and calling out that oppression that was, for me, more painful than, because it was coming from another person of color. And then I think that we have to, as people of color in this work, as we're getting more power and proximity to power, hold ourselves accountable, because I found, for me, at times now that I hire staff and I'm in a leadership role, sometimes there's something that will pop up in my head that's like, oh my God, where did that come from? Because that abusive leadership that I experienced has traumatized me and now lives in me. And if I don't heal from that and call that out and hold myself accountable, I can quite easily repeat that behavior. And so when I'm thinking something crazy, I tell my partner, Will, who was here, like, oh my God, I thought something crazy today. And, in particular, I'll just share this quick story because I think this is such an important point. I was interviewing this woman of color for a position in my foundation, and she was brilliant. And I thought, oh my gosh, she's going to come in here and be smarter than me and try to take my job, right? And I was like, oh, why did I think that? Like that mindset of scarcity and not abundance, like, why did I think that? And I thought that because that was the leadership that I had seen modeled to me and experienced, and I have this little bit of power in this platform, and it feels good, and I didn't want someone to take it from me, right? And so I told my partner about that mentality, that thing that came up in my mind, and then I went immediately and hired this woman. I was like, this is wrong. Like, I can't believe that I am actually beginning to perpetuate this abusive type of this internalized this oppression, right? And she's been an amazing colleague, and I made the right choice, and she's shining bright, and I love that I hired her. So I think that we have to know that internalized oppression is real for people of color. Find ways to hold yourself accountable. We as a community need to hold our other leadership of color accountable. And then the last thing, because I love this subject, search firms call me all the time because they want a person of color, right? And that's a good thing. Representation matters. We need diversity. But we also need to understand that because a person is a person of color, they may not have the analysis. We need to go beyond skin color and understand and ask questions about how are you accountable to your community, right? So not how are we holding the community accountable, how are we accountable to community? How do we show up in community? Are we actually, what is our leadership like? Are we bringing other people of color behind us, or are we oppressing others? Because that happens a lot, unfortunately, in philanthropy because of the power that is kind of concentrated in this space.
One more. Yeah.
Hi. So I work with an institute that does research both on philanthropy as an institution and on donors. And it's from that context, I'm wondering, while you were researching and writing this book, was there research you found lacking that you wish had existed, statistics or other sort of studies that might have helped make your point and be more convincing?
No. No, yes and no. I mean, I think that Native communities, we could definitely probably have more data about giving or the lack of giving. We have a report at Native American Philanthropy that's really old in terms of how much philanthropic money is going into Native communities. Probably be nice to update that. But, and I say this with all respect because research is really, really important. But I feel like philanthropy often has a tendency to like over-research things I don't know what else I can tell a foundation. Like there's enough data to show the disparities, the race wealth gap, the lack of investment in communities of color. And I saw recently that a university got like a huge grant to study diversity in foundations or something. I'm like, what do we need a grant for that? Like, we can count. Like, we already know. We do a census every year. Like, we know. And so I don't know. So I'm a little bit, and I worked in a research institution, so I probably have that trauma too. But so no, research is great. It's important, but research needs to be decolonized in its own place. But I think that where I'm pushing is for philanthropy to just do it. Like, let's move beyond another report, another research study. Learn by funding. When you move money into communities, you will learn. You'll learn so much more. So no, I didn't see a particular gap. A big question someone called me doing some research recently was around what does the next generation of giving look like for wealthy Native Americans, and I was like, I don't know any, so I can't help you with that research. There are a few, but in terms of us having so much wealth that my parents were philanthropists and I've inherited that wealth and now I'm a philanthropist, that's very, very few people. I think that when you look at giving in communities of color, a lot of it's not monetary, like money. We are taking care of our families and buying my grandma a hot water heater and like sending my cousin Stacy some shoes, things like that don't get counted. And so we get the narrative is that we're takers and not givers. And I know that we are the first philanthropists. We're so charitable. We're taking care of our communities. Our paycheck is a community paycheck. So if there's any way for you all to demonstrate the vast capacity of our giving in communities of color in ways that would help change that narrative that we are the generous queens, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank the Strand so much for having us for this discussion, and Edgar for coming and sharing your ideas and your amazing book. And I want to thank all of you for coming out in the rain tonight. I know it was like cold and nasty, and I really appreciate all of you being here. Thank you so much.
And Edgar's book is for sale right over there. I promise you it's fascinating. Thank you so much, you guys.